In the opening scene of the movie, we see a husband and wife vacationing in the Polish countryside. We learn that the husband goes by Joe and the wife is named Lara. It turns out that these two used to be top secret agents for the US, but they decided to retire early and start a family. That morning, Joe and Lara grabbed breakfast with a couple of French tourists who were also on vacation. They all kept chatting and getting to know each other. The woman tourist mentioned that she worked as a doctor at a hospital. Then she asked Joe and Lara about their jobs, but they didn't want to reveal that they used to be secret agents, so they just said they ran a business. After breakfast, Joe and Lara went back to the inn. Joe asked Lara to come explore the countryside with the other tourists, but Lara wasn't feeling well, so she decided to stay back at the inn. Joe ended up going with the other tourists, but before he left, he grabbed a weapon, just in case something went wrong on the trip. Joe and the other tourists went on a forest tour with a guide while somewhere else, 2 CIA members flew a small plane towards the forest. Suddenly, their plane was shot down and they crashed into the forest. Joe heard a big boom and went to check it out. Lara saw a bunch of black smoke in the middle of the forest and freaked out about Joe. She quickly texted him using her satellite phone. Joe and the tourists were totally taken aback when they realized that the explosion was from a plane crash. Joe and the lady tourist, who happened to be a doctor, quickly checked on the pilot, only to find out that he and the co-pilot were both dead from gunshot wounds to the head. It was clear to Joe and the doctor that this was no ordinary accident. Someone had intentionally shot the plane down. And, to make matters worse, Joe, being a former secret agent, could tell that the 2 deceased were actually undercover CIA agents. Shortly after, Joe came across a hard drive in the shirt pocket of one of the dead agents and snatched it up. The doctor told him not to because it wasn't his, but Joe ignored the warning, insisting that the hard drive must have some secrets in it. Joe and the doctor just found out that the radio on the plane was still on, so their chat had been overheard by the head office. It was right. The CIA office heard Joe talking about taking the hard drive. One of the CIA agents quickly told the boss about Joe taking the hard drive. The boss reacted right away, because it turns out the hard drive was super important and had all the evidence of his corruption. He asked where his guys' plane went down. The guy said it was in the middle of a forest in rural Poland. Joe told the doctor and the other tourists to go back to the inn, because it wasn't safe there. But before they could leave, they got surrounded by a bunch of mercenaries. The leader, Orlin, asked the tour guide why they were in the middle of the forest, and the guy said they were just tourists who happened to see a plane crash. Orlin asked the doctor where she was from, but when she didn't want to answer, he shot her. Then he asked Joe if he found the hard drive on the plane, and even though Joe had it, he said he didn't know. Orlin pointed a gun at him, but Joe stayed cool and convinced Orlin he wasn't lying. When Orlin's guys went to check out the crashed plane, Joe snatched a gun from one of them and took on the whole squad by himself. Then he tried to make a run for it by stealing the bad guy's car, but it ran out of gas and died in the middle of the road. Luckily, Joe was able to grab a motorcycle from one of the enemies and make his getaway. In another place, an old guy named Chester was spotted, and he was also a secret agent just like Joe, but he was still working for the government. The CIA boss got in touch with him and assigned him a job to nab Joe in the Polish countryside. Chester wanted to know why they had to go after their ex-agent who had retired 5 years ago. The CIA boss explained that Joe had swiped a hard drive that belonged to the CIA. So they had no choice but to catch him. The boss also promised that if Chester could grab Joe and get the hard drive back, he would get a bonus. Chester felt it was his duty to the country, so he accepted the mission from the CIA boss. On that same day, Chester hopped on a plane to Poland. Orlin couldn't find Joe, but he was pretty sure Joe was still in the forest somewhere. Orlin yelled out that Joe should just give up. Otherwise, he'd go to the inn and hurt all the tourists, including Lara. Joe, who was hiding and heard the threat, quickly got in touch with Lara and told her to be ready for trouble. When Lara got the message, she got her weapons ready right away. She went to her neighbor's room at the inn and asked them to hide under the bed because trouble was on the way. Right after she made sure the inn was safe, 3 of Orlin's men suddenly went to the inn and went in. However, as soon as they walked in, Lara wasted no time in taking them out. Meanwhile, Chester had just gotten to the hotel near where Joe was. He gave the person who took him there some poison to see if it worked. The person dropped dead right after leaving the hotel. Chester just smirked because his poison was super strong. Joe had just gotten to the village and wanted to find a spot to take a rest. He ended up breaking into a house that no one was in, so he could take a breather for a bit. Then he used their phone to call the big shot at the CIA. When he got through, he asked what was on the hard drive that had everyone so worked up. The leader said it had important info about the government and suggested Joe give it back, but Joe didn't buy it. He knew the drive probably had dirt on the corrupt CIA leader and others in charge. He told the leader he wasn't handing it over because he was sick of all the corruption. He planned to expose what was on the drive to the public. This freaked out the CIA leader, who then tracked Joe's location from the call. Once the CIA leader got Joe's location, he quickly got in touch with Chester and gave him the green light to take out Joe and grab the hard drive. Chester wasted no time and hurried to Joe's spot. Joe, on the other side, gave Lara a call to say sorry for causing all this craziness by taking the hard drive from the crashed plane. He did it to expose the corrupt politician, and Lara was totally on board with his decision. She told him to be careful and not to stress about her, because she could handle herself. After the leader hung up the phone, Joe had a surprise visitor who turned out to be Chester. Joe greeted Chester super casually, because they already knew each other. Chester acted like he was just popping in to see an old buddy. They even caught up and asked how each other was doing. Chester wanted to know if Joe had taken the hard drive from the plane crash. Joe fibbed and said that Orlin had taken it, but Chester wasn't buying it and told Joe to hand over the hard drive instead of getting into a fight. Chester poured them both a drink, but for some reason Joe didn't drink his. He asked about Orlin and why so many people were after the hard drive. Chester explained that Orlin was sent by the Russian intelligence to steal the hard drive, and if they got it, they could wreck the US. Joe then asked why Chester was so sure that the hard drive contained important government data, and what if it actually contained dirt on the CIA leader and other high officials. Chester said he didn't care, as long as he got paid for the mission. Lara, on the other hand, went to the inn's cafe and saw a bunch of tourists trapped by Orlin's guys. She snuck upstairs and took out one of the guards. Then she told the tourists to hang tight while she took care of the guards downstairs. Downstairs, two guards were having a drink downstairs when they heard a loud thud. They discovered that their friend had been pushed by Lara on purpose. Orlin's main guy then told his crew to search the upper floor, but he ended up falling down the stairs and knocking himself out. This made Orlin's right-hand man tell the rest of the crew to go after Lara, but she ended up taking out a bunch of them.
Hands up!
She eventually got cornered by the remaining mercenaries, but thankfully she had a little knife hidden in her hair and was able to defeat them with it. After that, she had to deal with Orlin's right-hand man, but she was already so tired that she couldn't fight back when he finally overpowered her. They made her sit in a chair and started asking her questions. She refused to give up the hard drive, saying she and Joe would never hand it over. When the man heard Joe's name, he realized she was Joe's wife. He told her to call Joe and tell him to give up the hard drive. She agreed, but only if he gave her back her satellite phone, since that was the only way to reach Joe. When he handed it over, she quickly entered a code, and there was a small explosion, blinding the bad guys. She took advantage of the chaos to defeat the rest of them. Orlin and his guys found out where Joe was from a local and surrounded the place. He told 3 of his guys to go in and fight Joe, but they didn't want to because they knew Joe wasn't just some random guy. Orlin got really angry and ended up killing those 3 guys. Joe and Chester looked around and saw that Orlin and his crew had the place surrounded. Chester asked Joe for help getting up because his back was acting up again. When Joe helped him, Chester sneakily injected him with something. It turned out to be poison, and Chester said Joe would only last 24 hours without the antidote. Chester promised to give him the antidote if Joe handed over the hard drive. Joe agreed, but only after they took care of Orlin and his crew. Chester then opened the window and shot the electric pole, making the lights go out. When Orlin realized he was under attack, he told his guys to shoot at the building. Then he launched a smoke grenade into the house, filling it with smoke. His men went in, but Joe and Chester were ready, and a big shootout started. In the middle of the fight, Chester chucked a grenade that busted through the wall. When the explosion happened, it made Joe drop the hard drive he was holding, and Chester swooped in and grabbed it. After that, Chester pounded Joe and made a run for it, leaving Joe to fend for himself against Orlin and his crew. One of Orlin's guys tossed a grenade, and there was a huge boom. Joe got thrown and hurt. Soon after, Orlin showed up and came at Joe with his gun out. He asked why Joe didn't just hand over the drive to avoid all this trouble. Joe asked back what the hard drive meant to him. Orlin said the hard drive had all the evidence of the CIA leader and high-up American officials' corruption. He hated them all, and the only way to take them down was with that hard drive. He also said he was the one who shot down the little plane in the forest, all to get the hard drive. When Joe heard this, he suddenly realized that Orlin wasn't a Russian spy sent to take him out. They actually had the same goal of taking down the corrupt politicians. In the end, Joe said sorry and admitted that his hard drive had been swiped by Chester. Then he suggested they team up to track down Chester. Orlin agreed and took off to chase Chester. During the trip, Joe got in touch with the head of the CIA and told him he was going to spill all his dirty secrets. The CIA boss, Cockley, said that Chester had gotten hold of the hard drive, and he knew Chester had poisoned Joe. Joe shot back that the needle didn't break his skin, so he wasn't going to die for sure. Hearing this, the CIA boss quickly told his guys to send a killer drone to take out Joe and Orlin. Not long after, 2 deadly drones were spotted searching for Joe's location. Once they located Joe, who was with Orlin, the drones started shooting at them. Fortunately, Joe and Orlin managed to dodge the bullets and speed away. But the drones kept chasing and shooting until they ended up crashing the car into the inn. Thankfully, Joe and Orlin were unharmed. They quickly shot at the drones. After they took down one of the drones, Orlin sneaked up on Joe with a gun and said they both wanted the same thing, but he wanted to do it by himself. Joe was about to give in when Lara shot Orlin from behind, straight into his head, killing him instantly. Joe and Lara had to run away from the other drone that was still chasing them. It shot a missile and made a big boom. But Joe and Lara were able to dodge it, even though they got pretty banged up. In the morning, Joe and Lara went to the lake's edge for help because Lara got hurt pretty bad but was mostly okay. Then out of nowhere, Chester showed up and Joe asked why he was still around. Chester said he felt too weak to leave. That's when Joe told him that he had poisoned him and had the antidote. Chester realized he had drunk the poison drink before. Joe said he'd give him the antidote if Chester helped him take down the CIA leader and other corrupt officials and gave back the hard drive. Chester didn't have much choice, so he agreed to Joe's terms and joined him.